Okay, so now we are able to, we're now listing our items that we can craft, and we've added in the ability to select these items. We need to load up the list of materials that is required to craft these items. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in on-click event listener, and we're just going to call this we'll call this load required materials, and inside of here we're going to put the name or the ID of the required material, the required item. So we're passing in the ID there into the on-click event. So we're going to come down to our scripts, and I'll just pull this down a bit. We'll create the new function. Load required materials, and it's going to hold one variable. So we can put this, we can start off by putting the bit of code that highlights the word or the option into this function. So we save this and we come over and just refresh. You can still see it works fine running through the on-click event listener. And what we now need to do is we need to send an AJAX request. And we're going to create a new page called craft.function.php. So we'll just save this, craft.function.php. The type of request we're going to send is going to be a post request. And we're going to send this to the URL of plugin craft.function.php, and the data we're going to send over is simply going to be the name, the ID of the item. Which is going to be X. We're also going to send over a mode of check requirements. So we're going to first obviously require the setup include script. Well, it's just closed on me, I think. And we're going to run an if statement. So if post mode equals check requirements, I think that's what we called it. Sorry, check requirement. Then we're going to run a script. So we're going to collect this all the data from the material list for the particular item. Then we're going to break it up into an array, and we're going to list it out by name. So we're going to take the item ID from the posted ID that's sent over, and we're going to run a query. And the query is going to be select material list from item recipes, where the ID equals the item ID. I'm just going to limit that to 1. We're going to store the data into the SQL. Query, and store the return data into the variable of row. So now we're fetching that list. I think what we're going to do before this though is we're going to run an if statement and just check that we actually get data returned, or we get there is data being fetched from the database. We'll just return false for now there. And what we can do, we'll just for now echo out the row material list. And we'll just come back over to our craft plugin, and we'll say that on the success, run the function, and we need to we'll give this a class, this middle div a class, and we'll just call this item requirements. And we will return the message output from here into that div by targeting div and just setting the HTML to the return message. So we'll save and we'll just come back and test. And as you can see, when we click one of these items, it gives us what's returned out of the database. So now we need to break down this list, and we will store this in an array, and this array name will be required. And so we're going to explode by a comma the material list here. So you can just get rid of that one now. So each of the individual materials is stored in the required array. So we now run a for each loop. As v. And now we need to run separate queries to run against the raw materials database to find out each of the names of the that are required for each item. So, query select the name from raw materials where the ID is equal to v, limit that to 1, dump it in SQL, and we'll just return it into name. We'll return it into item. And then on the return string, or the return variable, we will just output the name of the item inside paragraph tags to break it up nicely. So item name, and then we'll just echo out return like that. So this should now turn each of these into the raw materials required to create each item. So you can see here, need 2 argites, negadum, exonium for a combat blade, for armoring. These are what's required, and for a gun, these are required. So now we need to check to see whether we're actually able to craft each of these items. And like I said in the previous video, we've got 2 choices we can take. We can either say that in this box here that we can't create an item because we haven't got enough of the enough raw materials, or we can highlight these red. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go for highlighting them red. And also, you can see here we've got 2 of the same item. And what we'll also do is we will put that into one item, into one name, and just put you know, a quantity required for each of them. So I'm going to pause the video, put this code together, then we'll come back and take a look and we'll go through it, and then I'll end this video after I've given you a brief explanation on how it's running, and then we'll go into more detail in the next video. So as you can see here, the returned raw material names are either being returned red if we haven't got them, or they're being returned a normal colour if we have got sufficient amount. So for the combat blade, I've got nothing, you know, in terms of raw materials that I can use to create this item. But in armoring, I've got a positive hematomite, but I haven't got anything else. And the same with gun, I've got absolutely nothing. So, excuse me. Using the code that we used from the refined function plugin, and using the same logic behind it, where we're counting how many of each materials are required, we're using the same logic when checking whether we've got the items here. So on this for each loop, before this for each loop, what we're doing is we're saying that required, the array of required equals the array count of values, which, like I said before, counts up all the identical values of an array and returns a quantity of each value. So with this one here, where we've got 8, 8, 99 and 52, it would actually return an 8. There's 2 8s, there's 199 and 152. So we can use this to our advantage when it comes down to displaying them, because rather than having 2 of the same item displayed, we can actually reduce it and put the quantity that's required there, rather than multiple of the same item. And I can increase the number of that's required, and the number will just increase. So if I edit this, and we'll put 2 more 8s required. And we come over to here, you can now see that we now need 4 of them rather than 2. So on this for each, we're taking the key and the value, whereas before the value was the ID, the value is now the number of ID of the item IDs that exist in the array, and we're now using key to grab the ID of the materials required. So I've got a variable here that's blanking out. It's called styling, and I'll show you what that's for in a minute. Saying if query equals select name from raw materials, where ID equals, and this is where we had V before, we now change it to K, because we're using the key rather than the value. And this part, all this part here, is we used in our refine function page. This is where we're running the check to see if we've got the quantity of materials required. So we're selecting the material quantity from the user materials table, where the material ID equals K, and the material type, and this time equals raw, and the character ID equals the session character ID. We're obviously running the query and storing the data, restoring the returned values. And if the quantity of the material is obviously less than the required quantity of that certain item, this is where this styling variable is coming into play. You notice there's a space, and we're actually setting the colour of the material of that word to sort of like a red. And then we're placing this variable inside the paragraph tags here, and you'll notice that I've got it butted right up against the P for the paragraph tag, hence why we've got a space there. Otherwise you'll have it'll be always output like that, which isn't best. No, it's not really a good thing. We don't want that messy coding. So if the v variable, so if the quantity of that required item is more than 1, we're making a return in paragraph tags. We're saying the item name required, and then we're displaying the number of items, the number of that specific item that's required to craft this material. And if the v does equal 1, we're just simply putting out the name by itself. And that gives you this effect, whereas this one's got multiple, this one's got a single. And now what we need to do is we need to also be able to populate this field here with a message at the same time as this is being populated. So we'll get onto that one in the next video, so join me then.